My father didn't even lower his voice when he said it. Standing at the front of a rented ballroom, champagne glass raised toward the chandeliers like he was blessing royalty, my father looked at my sister in her crimson silk Harvard graduation gown and announced, in front of 200 people, that the Tesla was hers, the $13 million Beacon Hill brownstone was hers, and one day, everything with our family name on it would be hers too. Then he turned toward the back of the room, toward me, and said, with that particular smile he saved for moments he wanted to be remembered, "Every family gets one child who carries the future forward, and one who just watches it happen." The room laughed. I was sitting near the exit in a black dress I bought on clearance after a 14-hour shift. I kept my face still. I had learned a long time ago that crying in front of my family didn't soften them. It only entertained them. Then the ballroom doors opened. A tall man in a charcoal suit stepped inside, scanned the room once, past the champagne towers, past the donors, past my sister being photographed like a senator, and walked directly, deliberately, to my table. My father's smile disappeared first. Then my mother's. Then my sister's. The man stopped beside me, placed a thick cream envelope in my hands, leaned close enough that only I could hear him, and said 7 words. "Now it's time to show them who you really are." I looked down at that envelope and understood one thing immediately. Whatever was inside it had enough power to make my entire family afraid. This is the story of how the daughter they called dumb turned out to be the only one who knew where the real inheritance lived. My name is Mia Anderson. I am 29 years old. And for most of my life, I have been my family's polite little tragedy. Not hated. Not abused in the way that makes dramatic headlines. Just quietly, consistently, methodically underestimated. The way you overlook a piece of paper because it's been filed in the wrong folder for so long that everyone forgets it was ever important. The label started when I was 10 years old. Christmas dinner. 15 relatives around a long table draped in white linen and the smell of my mother's pine centerpiece. My father decided it would be charming if each of the children read their thank you cards out loud. A sweet tradition. A performance I was completely unprepared for. I picked up my card, looked at the first sentence, and felt the letters begin to rearrange themselves the way they always did under pressure. I flipped 2 words. Froze on a third. Stumbled back to the second line and read it again in the wrong order. My father corrected me. Not quietly. Not privately. With that particular kind of smiling patience that adults use when they want humiliation to sound educational. The tone that says, "I am being so gentle with you right now," while the entire room watches you dissolve. "Sound it out, Mia. Take your time." My sister Chloe, 2 years younger and already sharper in the way that made adults sigh with relief, picked up her card without hesitation and read every word perfectly. She got applause. The kind of genuine, surprised applause that tells you people were not expecting something to be that good. I got a pat on the shoulder and a redirect to my dessert. That was the moment the family script was written. And once it was written, every single thing that happened afterward was filtered through it. My stumbling became proof of stupidity. Chloe's ease became proof of brilliance. No one stopped to ask whether ease under performance pressure and intelligence were actually the same thing, because the story was already more comfortable than the question. Chloe won spelling bees, debate medals, scholarship interviews. She gave speeches that made adults tear up. She collected academic honors the way some children collect seashells, casually, abundantly, without seeming to try very hard. She got into Harvard on her first application and walked across that stage 4 years later while my parents wept openly in the front row. I mixed up lines when I was nervous. I lost points on timed tests because the clock made my brain feel like a radio station going in and out of signal. I learned to spot, before any conversation had even started, the exact moment when an adult had decided I was the defective version of the Anderson daughters. You can see it in the slight recalibration of their expectations. The almost imperceptible dropping of the ceiling. My mother would say, gently, carefully, like she was trying not to break something fragile, "Chloe has discipline." My father would say, with the resigned sigh of a man who had accepted a disappointing sports score, "Mia just doesn't think clearly under pressure." Neither of them ever considered the alternative. That I was not stupid. That I was not lazy. That I was not broken. That I was dyslexic. Undiagnosed until I was 22. Undertreated until I was 25. And quietly, spectacularly excellent at spatial reasoning in a way that no spelling bee had ever been designed to measure, and why parents never noticed that I could study a city map once and reconstruct it from memory with near-perfect accuracy. They never noticed that I could look at a page of overlapping survey symbols and find the single inconsistency that every other pair of eyes had skipped. They never noticed that the thing they called a flaw, the way my brain processed written words differently, was twinned with a gift they never thought to look for. But my grandmother noticed. Evelyn Anderson was the kind of woman who made other people feel slightly underdressed for the occasion of being around her, not because she cared about fashion, but because she was always paying attention to something everyone else had stopped looking at. She lived half the year in Boston and half outside Reno, Nevada, in a house with a wraparound porch and old filing cabinets full of things no one else in the family wanted to think about. Land plat maps, survey coordinates, mineral lease abstracts, chain of title records going back to the 1960s. The kind of paperwork that accumulates over generations in old landholding families and eventually gets shoved into boxes that everyone agrees will be dealt with later and are never dealt with at all. My parents called it dusty junk. My aunts called it mother's collection. Chloe once made a joke about how my grandmother's filing room smelled like a library that had given up on itself. I thought it smelled like a puzzle. The first time Evelyn handed me a stack of mineral surveys, I was 16. I had just come from a parent-teacher conference where my father had told the school principal, in front of me, while I sat 3 feet away in a plastic chair, that perhaps Mia simply wasn't built for academic work. Not built for it. Like I was a machine with a manufacturing defect. I drove with my grandmother to her Reno property that weekend in furious, jaw-clenched silence. She spread old documents across her kitchen table, put on a pot of coffee, sat down across from me, and said something no adult in my life had ever said before. Forget the words for a second. What do you see? I stared at the documents. The words did what they always did under pressure. Shifted, smeared, rearranged themselves into unreliable signals. So I stopped looking at the words and started looking at everything else. The lines. The symbols. The boundaries. The shapes formed by parcels on either side of a drawn edge. And I saw something. One parcel boundary didn't match the adjoining section lines. There was a gap, small, easy to miss if you were reading the document for its text rather than its geometry, where 2 surveys from different decades described the same corner differently. And there, in faded blue ink, handwritten in the margin of a page that had never been digitized, was a correction that had never been transferred into the official typed abstract. I pointed to it. My grandmother leaned forward and looked at me for a long moment. "Do you know what that means?" she asked. "It means the boundary is wrong," I said. "Or the abstract is. One of them is lying." She smiled. Not the polite smile adults gave me when I did something marginally acceptable. A real smile. Sharp and quiet and full of something that looked like finally. "It means," she said carefully, "that the Anderson family used to own something much larger than what your father brags about at cocktail parties." That summer changed my life. While Chloe was polishing college essays and my parents were buying her blazers for campus tours, I was spending my weekends in county record offices. In drone yards. In dry Nevada valleys that smelled like hot iron and old dust. I was learning to overlay historical plat maps with current satellite imagery. Learning to read abstracts backwards from their errors. Learning the language of land. Not the legal language, which I had to work twice as hard to decode, but the spatial language, the physical truth of where one piece of ground ended and another began. By the time I was 17, my grandmother and I had begun to uncover something that made us both sit very still at her kitchen table. The Anderson mineral rights corridor was broken. Not gone. Broken. A deed reference from 1984 had been filed incorrectly at the county clerk's office and never digitized properly into the modern database. The gap it created had caused the family's legal interest in a particular basin tract to go dormant. Not extinguished, not legally void, just overlooked and unexercised, the way you can own something for decades without realizing it because no one told you where to look. We found it because I saw the inconsistency in a corner plat that everyone else had dismissed as worthless desert. My father called it dust and rattlesnakes. Chloe, at a family dinner where she was describing her semester abroad, laughed and said the only inheritance I'd ever be qualified to manage was that desert tract, because there were no people there to disappoint. I smiled. I went home. I kept working. Because the worthless desert my family mocked was, as it turned out, not worthless at all. To be 26, I had built a life my parents had genuinely no framework for understanding. I was a geospatial data analyst for a land survey contractor, the kind of company that sends people with drones and precision instruments out to remote sites to rebuild property lines for energy infrastructure deals. The work was meticulous, unglamorous, and extremely well compensated. Not because it was glamorous. Because it was hard. Because most people couldn't do it. Because the ability to look at broken historical records, fractured survey chains, and decades of accumulated clerical error and reconstruct what was actually true required a kind of spatial pattern recognition that I had spent my entire adolescence being told was not a marketable skill. My parents kept introducing me at dinner parties as our other daughter. She does something with maps. Always with that same small laugh. Like my career was a placeholder. A polite fiction I was maintaining until I figured out how to become impressive. What they did not know, what they were constitutionally incapable of asking about, was that in my spare time, for the previous 2 years, I had been doing for my family what I did for clients at work. Rebuilding the title history on those Nevada parcels my grandmother had first shown me at 16. Tracing every deed, every lease abstract, every probate record, every survey correction going back to the 1960s. And finding that the Anderson family had been sitting on something they had completely failed to understand. A year before her death, Evelyn handed me a battered 1978 survey from Pershing County. One corner tract. The family had written it off as worthless decades ago. The tax notices were tiny, the kind of amount that gets paid automatically by an accountant without anyone's eyes ever landing on the line item. I rebuilt the parcel map from scratch. I traced the chain of title through probate records, handwritten amendments, and a 1984 clerk's supplemental filing that existed in only one physical copy in a county office in Nevada and had never been entered into any digital system anywhere. In that supplemental, I found it. A surviving mineral rights corridor, connecting the Anderson Corner tract to a much larger basin lease. Active, legally intact, and completely unexercised. Because the deed reference that would have made it visible had been misfiled 37 years ago and never corrected. I corrected it. My grandmother used the reconstructed title chain to reassert ownership through a private trust. We brought in a geologist for preliminary analysis. Then another. Then Titan Horizon Minerals, a mid-sized energy company expanding into lithium extraction in Nevada, conducted their own basin testing. The results came back strong. Stronger than anyone had expected. Negotiations began 18 months before Chloe's graduation. They concluded the morning of it. After tax allocations, retained royalties, and structured reserves, my direct disbursement as sole named beneficiary of the development trust was $86 million. $86 million. For work that began in my grandmother's kitchen at 16, when I was told by my own father that I wasn't built for academic achievement. For work that continued every weekend for years while my family was busy celebrating the brilliant daughter who was going to carry the Anderson legacy forward. For work that was only possible because I saw what they couldn't. Not because I was smarter in the ways they recognized, but because I was different in the ways they had spent my entire childhood trying to fix. I didn't open it in the ballroom. I took it into the ladies' room, locked the largest stall behind me, and stood there with my pulse hammering while Chloe's celebration roared faintly through the walls. The laughter. The music. The sound of champagne glasses meeting in toasts to someone else's future. Inside the envelope, a hotel key card for a private conference floor. A folded copy of a trust cover sheet reading Evelyn Anderson, Irrevocable Beneficiary Directive. And a Polaroid photograph. Me at 17, Nevada sun blazing, kneeling on the hood of my grandmother's old truck with survey maps spread across my lap like a paper landscape. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, 7 words. You were never the wrong granddaughter. Go. She had been dead for 6 weeks. My parents had called me after the funeral was over. They told me it was small and family only. They told me she would have understood because I was working in New Mexico that week. I had believed them because I had spent years training myself to expect less from people who shared my blood. I took the elevator to the private conference floor with my whole body numb. Nathan Cole, tall, composed, the kind of man whose presence in a room communicates that something of consequence is happening, was waiting in a suite overlooking the Charles River. He had been Evelyn's counsel for 14 years. He set down 3 documents. He slid the cashier's check toward me so slowly it felt almost merciful. Pay to the order of Mia Anderson. $86 million. I stared at the number for a long time. Not because I couldn't read it. Because for a moment I was waiting for the letters to rearrange themselves the way they always had under pressure, the way they had my entire life, the way that had made every adult I knew quietly revise their expectations of me downward. They didn't rearrange. The number stayed exactly as it was. Nathan explained everything. The acquisition. The title work. The trust structure Evelyn had built quietly over the previous 2 years. And then he told me the rest. The part about my parents. They hadn't just assumed Chloe would inherit. They had counted on it. They had borrowed against it, taken bridge loans against the Beacon Hill brownstone, and financed a luxury vehicle package in anticipation of a transfer of liquid assets once my grandmother's estate cleared. They had lobbied Evelyn to accelerate that transfer. And when she refused, they had done something far worse. They had tried to have me written out. A legal campaign, Nathan told me quietly. Drafted language describing me as emotionally volatile and not equipped for financial oversight. A push to limit my access to the estate for what they called stability reasons. My own parents, submitting documents to a lawyer arguing that the daughter they had spent 29 years calling the dumb one should be formally, legally excluded from any role in the family's financial future. Because they needed me out of the way. Because they had already spent the money. I looked out at the river for a long time. Then Nathan asked me whether I wanted the private route or the public route. I asked him a different question. Which one hurts them enough to make them stop lying? The next afternoon, I went to my parents' penthouse. Robert Anderson was in the dining room in a cashmere quarter-zip, reading congratulatory texts out loud to Elaine like a man narrating his own highlight reel. My mother had a florist unpacking white peonies in the entryway. 3 garment bags were laid across the sofa for what she kept referring to as the legacy dinner. The Anderson Foundation's annual event, that year repurposed as Chloe's formal coronation as the family's new public face. Chloe herself was barefoot at the kitchen island in silk trousers, laughing into her phone about job offers and donor board appointments and, direct quote, finally stepping into the position I was built for. No one stopped when I walked in. That was how invisible I had become in that home. Not hated. Not feared. Just discounted. A piece of furniture that happened to occasionally request attention. You picked a dramatic day to show up unannounced, my mother said eventually, with the tone she reserved for delivery problems. My father glanced at me, saw no tears, and decided to be amusing. Come to congratulate your sister properly? Chloe smirked without looking up. Careful. She'll probably ask if there's a spare room in the brownstone. I set the cream envelope on the marble counter between us. Actually, I said, I came to stop you from embarrassing yourselves in public. That got their attention. I pulled out the trust cover sheet. Chloe laughed the moment she saw legal letterhead. What, did Grandma leave you a dusty ranch and a sympathy note? How sweet. No, I said. She left me the Basin Trust, the acquisition rights, and the controlling beneficiary position you've all been borrowing against for months. My father smiled, the particular smile of a man who believes he is about to swat away nonsense. Mia. Enough. You have no idea how any of this works. That's funny, I said. Because I'm the reason it worked at all. He started toward me. My mother said my name in that warning tone designed to reduce a grown woman back to a child with a single syllable. Chloe folded her arms and said, "You really came here to cosplay competence on my weekend?" I looked at my sister, the golden child, the Harvard star, the one my father had just publicly promised the entire family's future to. And for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing when I looked at her. Then Nathan Cole stepped in from the open foyer behind me. None of them had heard him arrive. He carried a slim briefcase, a binder, and a specific kind of silence that makes wealthy people deeply uncomfortable because they cannot dominate it with volume. He set the cashier's check on the marble in front of me. $86 million. Printed clean and undeniable. Chloe whispered, "That's fake." Nathan produced bank verification, trust certification, and a notice of temporary asset restriction tied to the loans Robert had secured against property he did not legally control. That was the moment the room changed. Not when I spoke. Not when I challenged them. When the paper did. My father reached for the check on pure instinct. Nathan closed the folder over it. "Touching this would be unwise," he said. Robert turned on me with a fury so complete it was almost clarifying. "You did this. After everything we gave you. You gave me years of humiliation," I said, "and a front row seat to your favoritism. The money came from work. My work. And a grandmother who read documents you never bothered to because you assumed the dumb daughter couldn't possibly matter." Elaine started crying, but not from guilt. From fear. Chloe kept shaking her head, as if repetition could reverse reality. "This doesn't make you special," she said. "It makes you lucky." Nathan slid one more document across the counter. Notice of emergency trust hearing and governance review. Scheduled for that evening's founders' dinner, the one my parents had planned as Chloe's public coronation. "There will be no informal succession announcement tonight," Nathan said. "There will be a formal reading." My father swore. My mother begged Nathan to move this somewhere private. Chloe stepped around the island and got right in my face, voice low and precise. "You think money can buy class? You think one check makes you equal to me?" I had imagined this moment differently my entire life. I always thought that if I ever had power, I would use it to wound her back. To finally say something sharp enough to leave a mark she couldn't smooth away with a smile. Instead, I heard myself say the simplest true thing I had ever spoken in that apartment. "No," I said. "The check doesn't make me equal to you. It proves I never needed to be." Then I picked it up, tucked it into the envelope, and walked out while the family that had mocked me my whole life stood frozen around a number large enough to rewrite every lie they had ever told about who I was. The Anderson Founders' Dinner had always been less about philanthropy than theater. My parents loved renting museum halls and filling them with trustees, old money families, and reporters from the kind of local publications that still treated inherited wealth like civic virtue. That year was supposed to be Chloe's coronation. Harvard degree, polished smile, practiced gratitude, the exact resume that flatters the mythology of people who believe excellence is hereditary. I walked in wearing black. Nathan was beside me. So was a forensic accountant my grandmother had hired before her death, and a geologist from Titan Horizon who had worked directly on the Nevada Basin acquisition. I saw the room notice Chloe first, then me, then Nathan, then the folders in our hands. That was enough to send a ripple of unease through a crowd that had come expecting polished family branding and arrived at legal posture instead. Robert tried to intercept us near the stage. Nathan walked past him. The board chair, clearly aware that something irregular was happening, called the room to order with visible reluctance. My mother stood to redirect the evening. Nathan handed the chair a sealed authorization from the trust and stated that Evelyn Anderson's final directive required immediate public reading in the presence of trustees, beneficiaries, and officers of the Anderson Foundation. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. Like a held breath. Nathan read from the codicil. Evelyn Anderson had revoked all informal succession assumptions. Named me sole beneficiary of the Basin Trust proceeds. Transferred controlling governance authority over the Anderson Foundation to me. pending independent review, and required a forensic financial presentation before any ceremonial appointment of future foundation leadership. Chloe stood up and said I had manipulated a grieving old woman with desert fantasies and paperwork games. That was when Nathan played the video. My grandmother appeared on the projection screen behind the stage, filmed in her Reno study, wind chimes faintly audible outside the window. Her voice was rougher than I remembered, but steady. "If you're watching this," she said, "someone in my family has mistaken performance for merit again." She spoke about the basin parcels, the corrected title chain, the acquisition, my role in every step of it. And then she said the thing that landed like a blade through the room. Mia was never the dumb one. She was the one forced to work twice as hard while the rest of you mistook ease for intelligence. She is dyslexic. And she sees systems, she sees land, she sees what other people bury. I trusted her because she earned trust in silence while others demanded it with volume. My mother's hands started trembling and my father looked trapped inside his own tuxedo. Chloe stared at the screen with a hatred so naked it was almost embarrassing to witness. Then the forensic accountant began. He didn't grandstand. He did something far more devastating. He laid out numbers. Foundation reimbursements that had paid for Chloe's housing. Liquidity transfers timed around Robert's bridge loans. Unreported withdrawals routed through Shell consulting line items. Discretionary personal spending disguised as donor cultivation expenses. A vehicle reservation tied to the Tesla Robert had publicly promised Chloe. A deposit sequence tied to the brownstone he had been describing for months as though it already belonged to her. The room changed in increments. First confusion, then denial, then that awful particular silence that falls when scandal stops being rumor and becomes arithmetic. Robert blamed legacy staff. Chloe blamed bookkeeping. Elaine said Evelyn would never have wanted things aired like this. Then Nathan presented the final document. Records showing that Robert and Elaine had pursued a formal competency limitation strategy against Evelyn. Drafted language that described me as emotionally volatile and not equipped for financial oversight, in an attempt to legally exclude me from the estate before Evelyn could finalize the trust. The board chair requested ethics counsel. One trustee resigned on the spot. Another asked Chloe directly whether she had known about the reclassified foundation expenses tied to her name. She said no. Too fast. The geologist from Titan Horizon confirmed that the basin acquisition would never have closed without my reconstructed map set and corrected title chain. There was no refuge left. When the room turned toward a procedural vote, it did not feel triumphant. It felt surgical. All my life, my family had used public spaces to reduce me. That night, in the same kind of room, with the same kind of audience, they were the ones learning how helpless it feels when the people around you stop believing your version of events. The chair suspended the succession ceremony, moved to freeze discretionary authority, called for the immediate removal of Robert and Elaine from active foundation control, pending full investigation. Chloe's honorary appointment vanished before it had begun. The social death came before the financial one. In our family, that was always the cut that bled fastest. Donors stepped back in careful increments. Trustees checked their phones. One of Chloe's admirers on the junior board physically turned his body to avoid being photographed near her. Robert tried to argue with the board chair that no vote was valid under emotional duress. He was informed, in a tone so refined it sounded crueler than anger, that his personal distress was not relevant to governance procedure. Elaine discovered the difference between friendship and proximity within 30 seconds of approaching two donors she had known for years. And Chloe, who had spent her entire adult life moving through rooms as if they opened for her on instinct, stood in the center of one that had suddenly decided it wanted nothing to do with her. Nathan asked whether I wanted the check formally acknowledged that night, in front of the remaining trustees and the press who had started sniffing something ugly enough to print. "Tonight," I said. He handed the envelope to me in front of the room. Announced the Basin Trust disbursement. Had me sign the receipt. Camera shutters clicked. Someone in the back whispered the number out loud. 86 million. And the room shifted again. Not because money changes truth, but because it changes who listens when truth speaks. Robert saw those camera flashes and came toward me hard enough that 2 security staff moved before he reached me. "You vindictive little." He stopped when he realized half the room was watching. "Dad," I said, and the word sounded stranger than his fury. "Don't perform decency now." Chloe found me in the corridor outside the hall. She grabbed my wrist, quietly, not for the cameras, and whispered in the most honest voice I had ever heard from her. "Please, don't let them ruin me for this. I didn't know all of it. I knew some things were messy. But I have offers waiting. I have my whole life lined up." I recognized that sentence. I have my whole life lined up. So had I once. Until my family kept stepping on it. I pulled my hand free. "That sounds familiar," I said, and walked back inside. When the board asked what I intended to do with the authority my grandmother had placed in my hands, I could have chosen revenge theater. I could have announced I was taking the house, the accounts, the legacy portraits, every symbolic thing that would bruise them in the ways that matter most to people like my parents. Instead, I chose structure. I established an immediate vendor stabilization fund, a portion of my own basin proceeds, so that long-time staff and suppliers would not be crushed by a scandal my parents had created. I ordered an independent review of every staff pension contribution, because if foundation money had been drifting through personal vanity projects, workers would not be the ones left holding the damage. And I established a literacy and dyslexia scholarship in Evelyn Anderson's name. For students whose intelligence had been underestimated because it didn't show up in the neat, comfortable formats that schools and families find flattering to their own assumptions. That last one received more genuine applause than Chloe had all night. Robert heard it. And for the first time in my memory, he looked at me with something uglier than anger, not hatred, but recognition. The terrible, slow recognition of a man who finally understands what he threw away 0.6 weeks later. The brownstone was just a distressed asset in a sale process Robert couldn't control. The Tesla had never properly arrived. Elaine stopped posting. Robert burned through 3 law firms and discovered that outrage is not a legal defense. Chloe lost the advisory board role she had been name-dropping before commencement because elite institutions love polished success stories and have a specific, practiced aversion to avoidable scandal. She sent 2 voice notes, 1 email, and a handwritten letter in blue ink asking me to confirm publicly that she had been misled rather than complicit. I never gave her the sentence she wanted. I gave investigators the documents they asked for and myself the peace I had earned. That summer, I went back to Nevada. To the basin land my father once called worthless. To the ridge where my grandmother and I had stood at dawn with old survey maps, and the kind of patience that only people who have stopped trying to impress anyone ever manage to find. I had her final letter with me. Folded so many times the edges had gone soft. "People who need you small," she wrote, "will call you stupid. Because it is cheaper than admitting you can see what they missed. Do not spend your life begging to be properly named by people who profit from naming you wrong." I read that line 3 times. Then I laughed. For the first time in months. Not because any of it was funny, but because it was so precisely, brutally accurate that it felt like finally exhaling after years of held breath. In the fall, Chloe asked to meet. I agreed, against my better judgment. We sat in a quiet coffee shop in Cambridge. Far enough from Boston society that no one important would wander through, close enough to our old life that the air still felt familiar in a way I no longer trusted. She looked smaller without the audience. No silk, no audience, no script. Just a tired woman with excellent posture and nothing left to perform. "I was cruel to you," she said before I had even sat down. "I keep replaying the things I said. I assumed you'd always be there to absorb them. And I don't know what that says about me, except that it's ugly." I believed her. That was the problem with real apologies. They arrive after the damage, not before it. "It says you liked being loved at my expense," I told her. She cried quietly. I didn't. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for since the moment she walked through the coffee shop door. "Is there any way back?" I looked at my sister, the golden child, the Harvard star, the one our father had publicly crowned while I sat near the exit in clearance rack black, and I understood something with complete clarity. Forgiveness and access are not the same thing. Maybe, I said. But not through my bank account. Not through my public image. Not through pretending what happened wasn't real. She nodded as if that hurt. It probably did. Good. Some pain is supposed to remain instructional. We left separately. I walked back through the cold with my coat open and my shoulders lighter than they had been in years. My family had spent decades asking what was wrong with me. Why I wasn't easier, brighter, more polished, more like Chloe. Then one envelope, one check, one hearing, and one mountain of carefully documented truth turned the question so completely around that they couldn't find an angle that made it face the other way. I was never the dumb one. I was the one they could afford to underestimate. Until they couldn't. Good. Some pain is supposed to remain instructional. We left separately. I walked back through the cold with my coat open and my shoulders lighter than they had been in years. My family had spent decades asking what was wrong with me. Why I wasn't easier, brighter, more polished, more like Chloe. Then one envelope, one check, one hearing, and one mountain of carefully documented truth turned the question so completely around that they couldn't find an angle that made it face the other way. I was never the dumb one. I was the one they could afford to underestimate. Until they couldn't.